A wink from the waiter, and someone ends up dead. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me, where in the world are you joining from tonight? I always look forward to your comments. You can call it fate, coincidence, or the universe having a laugh. But it started with a wink. Not the kind you toss across a cocktail lounge when you're trying to get a number, but the kind you toss at a maitre d' when you're trying to get a table at a restaurant that usually considers you subhuman unless you arrive with royalty, or at least with a driver who wears gloves. It was Tuesday, which for Nero Wolfe meant tripe. That alone should explain why I was not having dinner at home. Fritz, our in-house culinary wizard, might be a genius, but there are some things even he can't make palatable to a guy like me. I need my dinner to resemble food, not a dare. So there I was, out on Madison Avenue, hoping to slide into a solo booth at Rondelet, a place with linen napkins so crisp they could double as shivs. Not my usual haunt, but I'd heard they'd added a crab risotto that might be worth enduring the snobbery. The hostess glanced at me like I was the guy who parks cars, then flipped open the reservation book with the enthusiasm of someone opening a jury summons. That's when he winked. The waiter. Tall, lean, and moving with the kind of ease you don't get unless you've spent serious time in expensive shoes. He looked at me, then looked at the hostess, and gave her a nod that meant something. 5 minutes later, I was sitting with a menu and a basket of bread warm enough to make peace with the universe. "Your server will be Paul," she said, and disappeared with the speed of someone late for a tantrum. Paul turned out to be the winker. Up close, he had the kind of face you trust immediately and regret it later. Smooth voice, knowing smile, and the habit of glancing sideways, like he was watching life from just outside the frame. He made a few suggestions, discreetly pushing the crab risotto, bless him, and then leaned in as he poured the wine. "You're Archie Goodwin," he said low. "Depends who's asking." "Someone who needs Nero Wolfe." Quietly. I didn't blink. I didn't sip. I looked at him the way Wolfe looks at an overcooked omelette. He didn't flinch. Something bad's going to happen here. Soon. I want out before it does. But I need leverage. I considered him. Why me? Because you'll believe me. Or at least you'll ask the right questions. And then, just as quickly, he straightened, smiled, and walked away to take another order like nothing had happened. I got through the risotto, excellent for the record, and made a mental note to compliment the pastry chef, then left a tip that was half curiosity, half insurance. Paul never came back. When I returned to the brownstone, it was 10:30. Wolfe was in the office, pretending to read Montaigne, but mostly waiting for me to announce something worth listening to. I dropped into the red leather chair and crossed my legs. "We may have a case," I said. "One with crab risotto and a wink." He did not look up. "That is nonsense. Cases do not consist of crustaceans and facial tics. This one might." He closed the book, not with a thud, but with finality. "Explain." And I did. Everything. The table that shouldn't have been mine, the waiter with the worried eyes, and the whispered warning about something bad, imminent and undefined. He listened. Eyes closed, fingers steepled, breath shallow. The man looked asleep, but I've seen toads look less dormant and still leap the second you move. When I finished, he opened one eye. "You left your name." I didn't have to. He already knew it. Now he opened both. That is the only compelling detail. The rest is conjecture and ego. I shrugged. Ego's cheaper than legal fees. And you're intrigued. He exhaled through his nose. "I'm not, but I will permit you to investigate for the sake of your indigestion." Which, in wolf speak, meant go snoop around and bring me something real or shut up. I stood. "Then I'll be back tomorrow with something to wrinkle your brow." "You'll be back with a stomachache," he said. But I could tell. The hook was in, And someone, somewhere at Rondelay, was about to find themselves on the wrong side of a winking waiter. When I came down the next morning, Fritz was already bustling in the kitchen, preparing something that smelled aggressively like tarragon. I grabbed coffee and beat it to the office, where Wolfe was halfway through his second glass of orange juice and looked at me as if I'd already said something disagreeable. "You've thought about it," I said, "and you're ready to admit there's something there." "I have thought," he said, "but I am not ready to admit. Persuade me. I'd rather do better than that." I pulled the envelope from my coat pocket, hand-delivered 5 minutes earlier by a teenager in a stained hoodie who looked like he hadn't slept since Jazz died. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and unmarked. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. Wolfe extended a finger and I laid it on his desk. He unfolded it with the care of a man unwrapping cheese. His eyes moved left to right, paused, then moved again. There were just 6 words, neatly typed. He was never supposed to serve. No signature, no date. I waited. Wolfe read it again, then set it down and stared at the orchids. I gave him a minute. 2. Then, "Now, I'm not saying it's earth-shattering, but it does make you wonder, if Paul the waiter wasn't supposed to be working that night, who was? And why the swap? And who noticed?" He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Saul is available." "I'll check." "Do so. Have him discreetly determine who was scheduled to serve tables last night at Rondelay, and whether any sudden changes were made. Also," he picked up the note and turned it between his fingers. "This was not mailed. No stamp. No postmark. Hand-delivered, like the sender was afraid to leave a trail. Which means," he said, folding his hands, "that our waiter either has allies or enemies who know what he tried to do. Maybe both. Possibly. Notify Mr. Panzer. You may also, at your discretion, return to the scene of the risotto." "On my own dime," he sniffed. "Do not be crass." I called Saul first. He said he could be at the restaurant by 11 and would work the staff lists, kitchen gossip, and anything in the back office ledger that hadn't been double-locked or burned. Then I slipped on a fresh tie, swung by the curb, and caught a cab to Rondelay. The place looked the same in the morning light, quiet, polished, and faintly disapproving. The maitre d' was off duty, but a hostess in a pencil skirt and flat voice was happy to tell me Paul wasn't working today. "He's not on shift?" I asked. "He left." "Left as in stepped out for lunch?" "Left as in resigned this morning." That got my attention. "Did he say why?" She gave me a look like I'd asked for the chef's mother's maiden name. "Personal reasons." I slipped her a business card. "If he comes back, or if anyone else wants to talk about it, that's me. I'm discreet. More or less." Outside, I called Wolfe and gave him the update. He made a low noise in his throat like a cat weighing whether to bother hissing. "He removed himself from play," he said, "which is inconvenient but telling. He's scared. He's alert. There's a difference. Fear is imprecise. This was executed. Great. So what now? Return here. We'll wait for Mr. Panzer's report. In the meantime, I will consider what may be implied by substitution, especially in so deliberate a setting." Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the plant rooms. I waited in the office and used the time to go over the note again, running the phrasing through every angle I could. He was never supposed to serve. Not fired, not misplaced, not even mistaken. Supposed to. That was someone thinking about plans, not accidents. Someone with an agenda. At 2:16 sharp, Saul Panzer arrived. He came in wearing his usual expression. 2 parts I've seen worse. And 1 part, I don't care to see it again. Wolfe returned and took his seat without preamble. "Well?" Saul nodded at me. I handed him a glass of water. He sat on the edge of the red chair like it might belong to a friend of a friend. "Paul Rizzoli," he said. Worked at Rondelay for 7 months. Took over a schedule swap last night with a guy named Jeremy Feld. According to kitchen staff, Feld was out sick. According to the official record, no sick note was filed. Feld is now unreachable. Unreachable, Wolfe repeated. Phone disconnected. Apartment door padlocked from the outside this morning by building management. Looks like an emergency order for non-payment, but that smells off. Too fast. Neighbors say he left in a hurry last night and didn't return. Interesting, Wolfe murmured. Continue. Rizzoli kept to himself. No history of trouble, but a few of the others thought he asked too many questions. New menu prep last week. He made a fuss about inventory. Not enough saffron, too much garlic oil. Trivial stuff, or not if you think in your terms. Wolfe's lip curled. I do. Saul reached into his jacket and handed over a folded piece of paper. One more thing. I copied a schedule list from the last 2 weeks. There were at least 3 unexpected swaps involving Rizzoli and Feld, each on a Tuesday. Chef rotates specials on Tuesdays. Wolfe took the paper and studied it. Then, without looking up, saffron. Garlic oil, inventory and substitutions. A pattern begins. I cleared my throat. You think the food's the angle? No, Mr. Goodwin. I think the menu was the vessel. The contents are yet unclear. What do you want next? We must speak to Mr. Rizzoli directly. Easier said. He resigned and vanished. Wolfe steepled his fingers. You will find him. Use the card. Leverage guilt, if nothing else. Tell him I will listen. That is not a promise I offer lightly. I nodded. If he's local, I'll dig him out. Wolfe closed his eyes again, the way he does when he's either solving a crime or fantasizing about roast duck. I gave Saul a nod and we stepped out to the hall. Thoughts? I asked him. Guy's hiding something, but I don't think it's criminal. No? He's not ducking cops, he's ducking someone else. Which meant whoever had been watching Paul was now watching the absence he'd left behind. Back in the office, Wolfe opened his eyes as I re-entered. You will find him, Archie. And if I do, then I will find the truth, as always, without rising from this chair. And for once, I believed him before he'd even finished the sentence. The trick to finding a man who doesn't want to be found is knowing what he values more than disappearing. In Paul Rizzoli's case, I figured it was probably the same reason he winked at me in the first place. He wanted to talk. He just didn't want to do it loud, public, or at the wrong moment. I started where I knew he wasn't. Rondelay. From there, I made a list. Staff records, addresses, former roommates, coffee shops within a 6-block radius. Saul had given me just enough to confirm Paul lived alone in a second-floor studio off 9th Avenue. The padlock on the door matched Saul's report. No sign of tampering, but the name tag had been scraped off the mailbox with a house key or something meaner. I tried the landlord. He told me, with the tone of a man who'd had his deposit stiffed too many times, that Paul had vacated in the night like a cockroach, with a conscience, which, while poetic, didn't help. Back at street level, I paused for a slice of pizza and reread the note we'd received. He was never supposed to serve. I let the words turn over in my head while the mozzarella cooled and the traffic honked in symphonic despair. Whoever wrote that message wasn't afraid of us. They were afraid of something else. And Paul, somehow, had put his tray down in the middle of it. I got my break around 3 o'clock, when I walked into a coffee shop 2 blocks from Rondelay and spotted one of the junior waiters I recognized from my dinner shift. The kind who thinks espresso foam is a personality trait. He was off duty and mid-croissant. Hey, I said casually, sliding into the booth across from him. Don't worry, not a food inspector. He looked at me like I'd just stepped in something. Do I know you? Not really, but you might know someone I'm looking for. Paul Rizzoli. Why? He's in a little trouble, not the kind that ends in handcuffs, the kind that ends in needing a very clever man to help him. I gave him a moment to digest that, then added, "That man's my employer." He folded the pastry bag like he was buying time. Paul doesn't like attention. No kidding, but he liked it enough to quit, vanish, and leave me a note about something bad on the way. That got him. He blinked. "You got a note?" "I did." He glanced around, leaned in, and dropped his voice. He was looking into something, said things weren't adding up in the kitchen. People taking inventory when they shouldn't, stuff going missing or being reordered without logging. He didn't know what it meant, but he thought it was organized. Organized how? He shrugged. Not kitchen hijinks. Bigger. He asked too many questions, then suddenly Jeremy calls out sick and Paul gets his shift. The next day he's gone. Anyone else know? Maybe Vito? He's one of the buses. He and Paul played cards sometimes. Vito's not subtle, but he remembers everything. Where do I find him? He scribbled a name and address on a napkin, handed it to me like it was contraband, and went back to his croissant. I left a 5 on the table and headed to the East 70s. Vito was easy to spot, short, broad, and built like someone who could lift 2 trays with one hand and an unconscious diner with the other. He opened his apartment door in a Yankees t-shirt and frowned. "I already gave blood this year," he said. "I'm not the Red Cross. I'm looking for Paul Rizzoli." His brow deepened. "What for?" "Because he stuck his nose somewhere interesting and then disappeared. I'm not a cop. I'm trying to help him stay one step ahead of whatever made him quit his job and leave no forwarding address." He looked at me for a long moment, then stood back. "Come in." His apartment smelled like linoleum and basil. He motioned to a chair. Paul said someone was using the Tuesday specials to move things. Not food. Packages. Like what kind of packages? He didn't know. Could have been money, pills, documents. Said it was always on a Tuesday, always when the chef was in early and the deliveries were light. Something would show up in the dry pantry that wasn't on the list, and by the end of service, it was gone. Hidden in the food? No, nothing that dramatic. Usually wrapped and tucked in a big flour sack or spice crate. Paul said the garlic oil jars were being rotated in and out, even when unopened. Anyone else know? I think someone found out Paul was watching. That's why he switched with Jeremy. Thought he could catch whoever was doing the drop. But I guess whoever was behind it figured him out first. I stood. "If Paul calls you, tell him I'm not with the cops. I'm with Nero Wolfe." Vito's eyebrows did a little hop. "The fat guy with the orchids?" "That's the one. I'll tell him, but he won't like it. That makes 2 of us." By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was nearing 6. Wolfe was in the dining room, pretending not to wait for dinner. I gave him the rundown. The garlic oil, the Tuesday swaps, the vanished Jeremy Feld and the panicked Paul Rizzoli. Wolfe chewed it over like a difficult mouthful of steak. "A courier system," he said finally. "Someone is using the restaurant as a conduit. The substitution of containers, likely outward bound. Laundering? Or distribution? Possibly blackmail. Perhaps documents. The product is less important than the method." He paused. "No one suspects the kitchen. It is sacred. Except Paul." "Except Paul." He folded his napkin. "And now he is in danger. You think they'll come after him? They already did. This," he tapped the note, "was a warning to us, but a message to him, that he broke their rhythm, and the rhythm is everything. So what now? You will find Jeremy Feld. And if he's dead, then the rhythm was already broken before Mr. Rizzoli stepped in, and someone is cleaning house." He looked at me, his eyes sharp behind the heavy lids. "You must be careful, Archie. If they are willing to frighten one waiter into resignation, they may be willing to do worse. That's why they pay me the big bucks." He sighed. "Number, that is why I have ulcers." And just like that, dinner was served. Trout, not tripe, to my eternal gratitude. But there was no peace in the brownstone. Not tonight, not while a vanished waiter held the key to a crime no one had named yet. The next morning began with eggs, toast, and an absence. Fritz, punctual to the second and fussy as a Swiss watch, had not emerged from the kitchen by 8:05. I didn't mention it immediately, but Wolfe's eyes narrowed the moment I put down his saucer without the customary buttery scent drifting behind it. At 8:07, I heard a cupboard slam. At 8:08, I excused myself. Wolfe didn't say anything, which is Wolfen for go, but I expect a full report. I found Fritz in the pantry, kneeling in front of the lower spice drawers like a man searching for his God and not liking what he'd found. The door to the dry goods cabinet was open. 2 jars of Hungarian paprika were on the floor, one upright, one sideways. "Something wrong?" I asked. Fritz turned his pale, serious face to me. "I'm missing a jar." "Of paprika?" He shook his head, lips tight. "Number garlic oil." That got my attention. "Are you sure?" Fritz stood, brushed his hands off on his apron, and pointed toward the back shelf. "There are always 6. I keep them together, in that corner. Today there are 5. Could you have used one yesterday? Number 8 is too strong for trout. I did not even open them." I looked at the shelf. The 5 remaining jars were identical. Clear glass, no labels, sealed with industrial screw tops. Innocent looking. I crouched, reached toward them, and Fritz hissed like I was reaching for the crown jewels. "Please, Mr. Goodwin, do not disturb them. I must examine." I stepped back. "Anything else touched?" He hesitated. The shelf felt wrong. The jars are in a different order, not just fewer. Shifted. Wolfe would want that exact phrasing. Shifted, not disturbed. Changed, but not obviously. I straightened. "Leave it as it is. I'll get Wolfe." Back in the office, Wolfe was reading something German and probably moralizing. He looked up, and I gave him the facts. The garlic oil, the missing jar, the rearrangement. Wolfe's expression didn't flicker. "I presume," he said, "that Fritz is certain." "He's as certain as a priest at communion." "Then we've been trespassed." His voice had changed, just slightly. Calmer, if that's possible. Lower. Wolfe only speaks softly when something hits close to his own marrow. Trespass was not a word he used lightly. Inside the brownstone, it meant a breach of the highest order. "Locks?" he asked. "No signs of tampering. Front and back doors were bolted. Windows untouched. Whoever it was, they either had a key or a very convincing set of skills." "I suspect the former," Wolfe said. "Panzer should be recalled. And we shall now, finally, summon Inspector Kramer." "Kramer?" I raised a brow. "You think this is already big enough to justify involving the NYPD?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that someone walked into my home last night and removed an object that may contain criminal material, and I think I have no interest in the possibility of becoming an accessory after the fact." That was enough. I called Saul, who promised to be at the brownstone by noon, and then rang Kramer's office. He grunted, swore, and said he'd be over within the hour. Apparently, he didn't have anything better to do than glare at Wolfe over the rims of his glasses. He arrived just before 11, smelling faintly of cigar ash and road rage. Wolfe didn't rise, of course, but he inclined his head. Diplomatic for him. "I hope," Kramer said, sitting hard in the client chair, "this isn't another of your $5 mysteries that ends in a butterfly collection and a poem." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "The butterfly, Inspector, is nature's misdirection. Beautiful, yes, but it survives through camouflage and deception, much like our current adversaries." I handed Kramer the facts. He took them in, scribbled notes, frowned at the garlic oil detail, and grunted again. "Let me get this straight. Some waiter feeds you a whisper about something shady happening at a restaurant. You go there, eat a risotto, and now your pantry's missing a condiment." "That is correct," Wolfe said, unbothered. Kramer snorted. You know how that sounds. Yes, it sounds like a man being tested, which is precisely what it is. He folded his hands and looked at Kramer with a solemn intensity that never failed to make even the most seasoned criminals confess, or at least perspire. Kramer sighed and gestured with his pencil. All right, then. What do you think was in that missing jar? A document, Wolfe said. Or a drive. Or cash. Something thin and concealable. Something that would not trigger suspicion if carried openly. Then why steal it from you? Because it was misdelivered. Or perhaps our guest, Paul Rizzoli's, interfered more successfully than we assumed. If the operation was disrupted last night, the perpetrators may have followed the trail to him, and from him to us. Lovely. Kramer stood, circled once, then stopped. All right, I'll have my guys sweep the perimeter. No press. Quiet for now. He turned to go, then paused. But if this turns out to be a pantry squabble between two obsessive cooks, I'm sending you the bill for my ulcer meds. Wolfe inclined his head again. A fair price for immunity. By the time Kramer's men finished dusting the kitchen and checking the locks, Saul Panzer had returned. I filled him in, and he nodded, unsmiling. I'll talk to the building's super. Cameras, if there are any. Someone came in through a door, not a wall, and they did it without leaving a mark. That's professional. Agreed, Wolfe said. Begin immediately. Once we were alone again, Wolfe picked up the remaining garlic oil jars, one by one, with the delicacy of a jeweler. He examined the seals, the weight, the glass. Then he turned to me. You will go back to Rondelet. Speak to the head chef. Do not mention crime. Inquire about their suppliers. Who manages spice orders, particularly imports. And note anyone who handles inventory without supervision. That's a pretty long list. Then trim it. Ruthlessly. He glanced at the clock, sighed, and pushed the garlic oil away. Mr. Goodwin. Yes? If someone is hiding illicit materials in food containers, then either the food is not what it seems, or the people serving it are not. You must determine which. I nodded. And if it's both, then we are dealing with people who understand how to blend flavor and fraud. Dangerous. I left with the feeling you get before a storm, not the flash and bang, but the slow, rising pressure in the air. Back at Rondelet, I tracked down the chef, a stout Frenchman named Alain, who believed every dish was a sermon and every ingredient a sacrament. I told him I was writing a piece on specialty imports in high-end restaurants and wanted to learn about his spice vendors. He looked suspicious, but the flattery helped. He rattled off 3 European companies and 1 New York middleman who supplied them with oils, powders, and essences. I jotted names, thanked him, and then asked casually who usually signed for those shipments. Usually, Jeremy or Paul, he said without blinking. They alternate depending on shift. And do you ever check the shipments yourself? I trust my people. Of course he did. Outside, I called Wolfe. Chef confirms Paul and Jeremy were the ones handling the spice deliveries. There was a pause. Then Wolfe said quietly, Then Mr. Rizzoli saw something, and Mr. Feld perhaps saw too much. It was the way he said it that told me. He was already imagining the next scene. A table, 5 suspects, and a chair that only Wolfe could fill. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Fritz had locked the kitchen like it was Fort Knox and was muttering German prayers to the remaining garlic oil jars. Saul had vanished again, probably shaking down the local locksmith guild for any trace of a bump key or a duplicate entry. Wolfe, on the other hand, had not moved so much as a pinky. He was sitting in the office, eyes half-lidded, as if digesting something denser than pork shoulder and more dangerous. I gave him the full rundown on Alain the chef, including the 3 importers and the conveniently unsupervised inventory handoffs. Wolfe listened without interrupting, which in our line of work meant I had his full attention. Did Alain appear anxious? He asked when I was done. Not exactly. Irritated, yes. Like I'd just asked if he microwaved the duck confit. He did not inquire why a private investigator was interested in condiments. I left the words private and investigator at home. Told him I was writing an article. And he believed you? He believed the flattery. That's usually all it takes. Wolfe's gaze drifted to the empty spot on his bookshelf where Larousse Gastronomique usually lived, like the book itself had gone into mourning over the missing garlic oil. That may suffice for now, he said, more to himself than to me. Then, louder, call Lon Cohen. I blinked. Lon? The Gazette? Yes. Tell him to look into 2 names. Jeremy Feld and Paul Rizzoli. I want employment records, civil filings, union connections, anything public. Inquire discreetly. We cannot be the only ones interested. You think someone else is tailing them? I think, Wolfe said, that if someone broke into my home to retrieve a single item, they are not just tidy, they are terrified. And desperate. Which is worse. I made the call. Lon was his usual cocktail of sarcasm and caffeine, but agreed to run the names and call back within the hour. Wolfe turned to the stack of spice vendor invoices I'd picked up from Rondelet and began flipping through them like a priest decoding scripture. I left him to it and wandered into the front room for coffee. By the time I returned, Wolfe had already arranged the invoices into 3 neat piles and placed a fountain pen across the top like a sword on a casket. These, he said, tapping the largest pile, are from a company called Edel and Schwartz, based in Queens. Sounds trustworthy, indeed, especially since their invoices contain 2 irregularities. Delivery weights do not match the order totals, and their contact address has changed 3 times in 2 months. Front company? Possibly. Or a legitimate company with illegitimate branches. Either way, they must be investigated. The phone rang before I could offer a wisecrack. I picked it up. It was Lon, fast-talking and hushed. Your guy Jeremy Feld, he said. He's got a record. Felony? Nope. Suspended sentence for obstruction. 3 years ago, caught moving pharmaceuticals under someone else's medical license. Lost a civil suit too. Paid out 10 grand. And Paul? Clean. Real clean. No traffic tickets. No lawsuits. Not even a gym membership. That clean? Yeah. Makes you wonder if Paul ever existed before 3 years ago. His paper trail starts in 2022. Alias? Could be. Or he's just the type who avoids systems. Either way, careful. This smells like something real. I hung up and relayed the details. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. The man with no history sees something. The man with a criminal history vanishes. A binary emerges. Black and white. Clean and dirty. He stood, an actual vertical movement, though still within his 1-room radius, and walked slowly to the windows. You will call Mr. Rizzoli. We don't know where he is. No, Wolfe said, but Mr. Vito might. You want me to shake him again? Number ask, and use honesty this time. Tell him the garlic oil was taken, here, from this house, and that we now require not only information, but protection. Protection for Paul? Protection for the truth, he said, which is what they are trying to bury. I made the call. Vito picked up on the second ring, his voice hoarse like he'd been sleeping under suspicion. When I told him what had happened, that someone had come into our kitchen and removed the very jar Paul had been tracking, he went silent. After a long pause, he said, I'll get a message to him. Fast? As fast as I can. But if you see a guy in a grey cap watching the block, that's not one of mine. We hung up. I relayed the warning to Wolfe. He nodded once. They are watching now. That means they know we know. That we know what? That they are vulnerable. It was almost dinner, but Wolfe wasn't interested in trout this time. He wasn't interested in food at all, which meant the universe had tilted at a dangerous angle. Instead, he called Saul back into the office and gave him orders to locate Edel and Schwartz's actual headquarters, real management, and any off-books logistics they might be handling. And Saul, Wolfe added, if you encounter resistance, do not apply force. Apply discomfort. Saul, who considered discomfort an art form, nodded and left. I stayed, watching Wolfe sit down slowly, stare at the orchids and murmur, a vanished waiter, a falsified shipment, and a jar that never contained what it claimed. The question is not who took the garlic oil. The question is who hid the first item in the first place. You think Paul did? I think Paul found it, but someone else placed it. I blinked. You think Rondelet's a drop site? That someone, yes, and the waiter was the mule, or thought he was. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Wolfe and I both turned. Fritz answered, then reappeared with the stiffness of a man carrying either a bomb or a secret. A gentleman to see you, Mr. Wolfe. He says he is Mr. Rizzoli. We both rose, but Wolfe raised a hand to keep me still. Show him in, Fritz, and offer nothing. Paul walked in looking like a man who hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and hadn't been sure he'd make it this far. His eyes were bloodshot, his collar askew, and his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a weathered grey coat. Mr. Wolfe, he said, nodding. Mr. Goodwin. You came, Wolfe said simply. I had to. They're going to kill someone. Who? Wolfe asked. Anyone who finds out what's in those jars. I wasn't supposed to open one, but I did. And? Paul swallowed. It wasn't garlic oil. It was a roll of negatives. Black and white photographs, labeled, indexed. All of them, people, in compromising positions. He paused. Politicians, union heads, a judge, blackmail, I said. Paul nodded. High level, quiet, and someone's laundering the material through ingredient shipments no one checks. Wolfe leaned forward. And the jar that vanished from my kitchen, what was in it? Paul met his gaze. A new set. Numbered, from last week. Do you know who sent it? Number, but I know who picks them up. Name. Paul hesitated. Now, Mr. Rizzoli. Paul took a breath. Alain, the chef. Wolfe exhaled through his nose. Of course. He sat back, eyes closed. Mr. Goodwin, tomorrow you will go back to Rondelet. Tell Alain I require his presence here. Politely. If he refuses, do not be polite. Paul shifted in his seat. He won't come willingly. Wolfe opened his eyes. Then we must entice him, with the only thing men like Alain fear more than exposure. What's that? I asked. Loss of control, Wolfe said, which at last he no longer has. It was a grey Thursday morning when I returned to Rondelet with a spring in my step and steel in my pocket, figuratively speaking. I had a mission, and missions, especially ones that made people squirm, always put a little shine on my shoes. Alain the chef was going to get an invitation he couldn't refuse. Wolfe didn't say those exact words. He doesn't like clichés, but the tone was there. I was to bring him back to the brownstone, whether by charm, coercion, or implication of scandal with a capital S. I arrived just after 11, when the lunch prep chaos was at full simmer. The kitchen was a ballet of blades and boiling stock pots, but Alain stood in the middle like a conductor. White coat, immaculate, voice sharp enough to julienne an onion. He saw me immediately and frowned like he'd just spotted a thumbprint on a soufflé. Ah, Mr. Goodwin again, he said. What are you investigating now? My oregano. I smiled. You're a busy man, chef. But I think you'll want to make room in your calendar. For what? For a conversation with Nero Wolfe. He'd like to speak with you, privately. He wiped his hands on a towel with theatrical disdain. I don't take job offers from eccentrics. It's not a job offer. Then I'm even less interested. I stepped closer. The clatter of knives and orders went on behind us, but my voice cut through clean. A jar went missing from our kitchen last night, chef. Garlic oil. You're familiar with the brand. We know you use the same supplier. He stiffened. That jar, I continued, contained photographs. Not of food, of people. Important ones, in compromising positions. If I'm not mistaken, the kind of positions that lead to resignations, subpoenas, or sudden vacations to countries with no extradition treaties. He didn't blink, but I saw the color shift in his face, like someone had turned down the gas under his confidence. You're bluffing. I handed him a slip of paper. It was Wolfe's handwriting, listing the delivery dates from Edel and Schwartz that didn't match their official ledgers. Mr. Wolfe does not bluff, I said. He invites. Alain looked at the paper like it might bite him, then carefully folded it and tucked it into his breast pocket. What happens if I decline? You won't, because if you do, that list goes to the inspector who visited our kitchen yesterday. And trust me, he's got a whole drawer of warrants just waiting for a reason. For a long moment, Alain said nothing. Then he gave a curt nod. I'll come after lunch. You'll come now. I have a kitchen to run. You had a kitchen to run, I said. His eyes narrowed. Then he turned, barked 3 commands in rapid French at his sous-chef, and stripped off his apron like he was shedding armor. We walked out without another word. The cab ride was quiet. Alain didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations. I knew that once he was in Wolfe's office, the real peeling would begin, layer by layer, like an onion that didn't cry out until the last cut. Wolfe was waiting when we arrived, seated as always in the large leathered chair behind his desk. The garlic oil jars had been removed. Wolfe had Fritz move them to the plant rooms as though their mere presence offended his equilibrium. Paul Rizzoli sat off to one side, silent but not cowering. Wolfe had given him a chair and a second chance. Alain walked in, took one look at Wolfe's calm, round face, and hesitated. Wolfe didn't move. Chef Alain, sit. Alain sat. No protest, no quip. Just compliance, like he was already halfway through the confession. I have not accused you of anything, Wolfe said, nor have I summoned the police. Yet. That's generous of you. It is necessary, Wolfe said mildly. I have no interest in guilt unless it is structural. I want to know who conceived the method. Alain licked his lips. What if I don't know? Then you're a fool, Wolfe said. And I do not believe you are a fool. Paul flinched, but Alain kept his expression still. Wolfe continued. You work in a high-end kitchen. You receive shipments of imported goods. Some arrive with more than advertised. You're asked to sign, to rotate, to maintain the rhythm. In return, you are paid, perhaps in silence, perhaps in security. No money, Alain said. Then what? Alain hesitated. They protect my brother. That got Wolfe's full attention. He's in France, Lyon. Ran with a group 5 years ago that got involved in some digital blackmail. The authorities were interested. He fled. They offered me a deal, help them. Keep things quiet here, and they'd keep their hands off him. Wolfe closed his eyes. A kitchen courier, built on extortion. They only asked that I ensure certain jars were undisturbed. I didn't look. I didn't ask. Until now, Wolfe said. They warned me. Said someone had interfered. That it had to be fixed. And did you fix it? Wolfe asked. Alain looked away. You came to my house, Wolfe said, and stole from my pantry. Is that correct? Alain didn't answer. Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly. You will answer, chef. Because if you do not, I will make that missing jar a matter of public record within the hour. Alain's jaw clenched. I came in through the rear service entrance. I used a key I was given when this started. I knew where to look. I took only the jar. I didn't touch. Anything else? Wolfe leaned back. And the negatives? Alain's voice was quiet. I destroyed them. Paul stirred. You what? They were leverage. Dangerous. If they'd been found, I'd be implicated. I had no choice. Wolfe shook his head. You had a choice. You merely chose self-preservation. What would you have done? Wolfe didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Paul. Mr. Rizzoli, are you prepared to testify that Alain delivered, stored, and enabled illicit material using containers disguised as culinary stock? Paul nodded. I saw the jars. I handled them. And I saw him sign for shipments he didn't inspect. Alain sagged. Wolfe folded his hands. Then we proceed. I stepped forward. To the police? No, Wolfe said. To the press. Alain blanched. The photographs were destroyed, Wolfe said, but the method remains. The supplier, Idle and Schwartz, will be exposed, and with Paul's testimony, the conduit will collapse. Those who used it will have to scatter. That puts a target on me, Paul said. Yes, Wolfe replied. Which is why you will leave town. Temporarily, I will fund your absence. Alain looked at Wolfe with something like admiration. Why not turn me in? Wolfe sniffed. Because you did not design the crime. You only enabled it. Poorly. That was that. Wolfe rang for Fritz, who escorted Alain out the front door with the ceremonial coolness of a maitre d' showing a man to his last meal. Paul stayed seated, staring at the floor. You okay with this? I asked him. He nodded. I didn't want to be part of it. I just didn't know how deep it went. Wolfe's voice cut in. You still don't, but now others will. He closed his eyes. Archie, contact Lon Cohen. Tell him the garlic oil was counterfeit, and tell him it was spicy. Spicy? Wolfe opened one eye. Metaphorically, of course. I smiled. Of course. And just like that, the game was done. Not with sirens or shootouts, but with a jar of oil, a few words, and a man who knew when to wink and when to run. The headlines broke by the next morning. Not front page, but above the fold on page 3 of the Gazette's Metro section, which is exactly where Wolfe likes his storms to start. Quiet enough to avoid panic, loud enough to start a chain reaction. Spiced with scandal. Gourmet import firm tied to blackmail ring. There were subheadings about Idle and Schwartz, a brief mention of unnamed kitchen staff at a Manhattan culinary institution, and speculation about contraband being passed through imported ingredient shipments, no names, no photos, and nothing that would bring a libel suit down on Lon Cohen's head, but it was enough. Wolfe's fingerprints weren't on the article, but I could practically hear his diction in every third sentence. The reaction was immediate. By 10 a.m., Rondelet had pulled its lunch reservations. By 10:30, health inspector had shown up at their back door, clipboard in hand. And by 11 o'clock, the NYPD had quietly sealed the Queen's warehouse that Idle and Schwartz had been operating from. Though, according to Saul, there wasn't much left but empty jars and shredded invoices. In the brownstone, the atmosphere was somewhere between post-op and post-war. Wolfe remained in the office, silent and still, his attention turned inward. Fritz tiptoed through the house like he was afraid of cracking a floorboard. Paul Rizzoli, having stayed the night under Wolfe's protection, paced the upstairs guest room like he was practicing for a role he hoped never to play again. I'd spent the better part of the morning fielding calls, Lon with follow-up questions, Kramer with thinly veiled irritation, and Saul with a dry update that 2 men associated with the supply shipments had skipped town overnight. No tickets, no bags, just silence and absence. It was around noon when Wolfe finally stirred. He called me in with a sharp Archie, the kind that carried command in every consonant. I entered the office. He was at his desk, not reading, but watching, thinking. We are near the end, he said. But not at it. I nodded. We hit the players. We broke the rhythm. The kitchen courier ring's done. What's missing? He looked up, the mind behind it. You think Alain wasn't the boss? I'm certain of it. He's competent, but not calculating. He did not devise the idea to embed blackmail material in olive oil jars. He did not select Tuesdays as drop days. He merely followed orders. And the ones giving those orders? That, Wolfe said, is what we must now uncover. He closed his eyes and steepled his fingers. I waited. Wolfe's silences aren't pauses. They're diagnostics. The operation was methodical, he said at last. It required 3 things: steady logistics, a clean delivery path, and protection from discovery. Which they had. Until Paul. Yes. Mr. Rizzoli was the unexpected variable, but the structure was too clean for this to be freelance crime. Someone had oversight. I considered. Someone at Edel and Schwartz? Possibly. But consider, how does one select a 5-star restaurant as a conduit? They had someone on the inside. More than that, Wolfe said. They had someone with influence and access. Someone who could place trust in Alain. Someone who wouldn't be questioned. He paused, and I saw it in his face. Recognition, dawning and unpleasant. You have a name, I said. He nodded. Bring in Paul. I fetched him from the guest room. He looked ragged but alert and a little steadier since the news had broken. He sat without being asked, which Wolfe let slide this once. Mr. Rizzoli, Wolfe said, I must ask you a final question. Paul nodded. Anything. When you first applied at Rondelet, who hired you? Paul hesitated. Technically, the owner. I interviewed with Alain, but the final paperwork came from the manager. She said the owner had signed off. Wolfe opened a drawer and pulled out a small folder. And the name of that owner? Paul frowned. It wasn't public. Shell Company on the documents. But one day, Alain got a call on the office landline and stepped out. I saw the caller ID flash, just initials, which were LG, Paul said. I only saw it for a second. Wolfe exhaled. Mr. Goodwin, call Saul. When Saul arrived 20 minutes later, he had already done his homework. LG, he said, stands for Leonard Gaffney. Name ring any bells? Should it? I asked. He's a silent partner in half a dozen high-end restaurants across the city. Former investment banker, now a consultant. Lives on the Upper East Side. Keeps a townhouse with 3 floors and no neighbors on either side. Wolfe's voice went sharp. And what is his connection to Edel and Schwartz? They're one of his holdings, Saul said. He funded them 2 years ago through a holding firm registered in Delaware. That's our architect, Wolfe said. I raised an eyebrow. You want to bring him here? No, Wolfe said. He would refuse, and the moment he realizes we know, he will disappear. We must draw him out, and to do that, we need bait. Paul shifted in his seat. You want to use me? Yes, Wolfe said without hesitation. You and the lie you will tell him. The plan was simple in outline, risky in execution. Paul would call Alain and report that Wolfe had handed the missing photographs to the police, but not all of them. One set, Paul would say, had been duplicated, held in reserve, and Paul would hint, without confirming, that Gaffney's name had come up. Not loudly, just enough to ring the right alarm bells. And then we'd wait. Paul made the call from the upstairs study. Alain didn't answer on the first try. On the second, he did. Paul delivered his lines calmly, smoothly. No need to press. Just the words backup negatives and names I didn't recognize were enough. He ended the call with a carefully planted seed. I'm heading back to the brownstone now. Wolfe wants to speak with me again. Then we waited. Wolfe did not rise, did not pace. He simply sat and waited with the patience of a mountain. At 6:47 p.m., the doorbell rang. Fritz answered. He returned, face pale, voice taut. Mr. Leonard Gaffney is here. He insists he has an appointment. Wolfe's eyes sparkled, not with joy, but with something colder, confirmation. "Show him in," Wolfe said, "and offer him a seat." Gaffney entered like a man who considered rooms to be extensions of his will. Sharp suit, graying temples, calm eyes. He scanned the room and dismissed me immediately. Wolfe, however, earned a flicker of interest. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, "I hear you've been collecting jars." Wolfe did not rise. "I collect nothing. I examine. And what I have examined, Mr. Gaffney, suggests you are not only a silent partner, but a director of illegal operations." Gaffney smiled. "Those are serious words, dangerous ones. They are accurate." Wolfe's voice didn't rise, but each syllable landed like a lead domino. "You placed material in food shipments, used employees as unwitting couriers, collected blackmail against figures of public interest. You did this using a legitimate business as your vessel, and protected yourself through layers of shell companies and silence. And what do you want?" Gaffney asked. "To end you," Wolfe said simply. "Not with bullets. With exposure." "You have no proof." "I have enough," Wolfe said, "and the rest is en route to the district attorney's office, unless you choose to cooperate." Gaffney blinked. The mask slipped. For a second, but it slipped. "What do you want?" he asked again, this time less confidently. "Names. Every participant, every recipient, every location. In return, I will ensure the press focuses elsewhere, for now." Gaffney considered. Then slowly, he nodded. "I'll need a pen," he said. Wolfe handed him one. Heavy, black, German. It glinted in the light like a verdict. The architect was caught. The rhythm, finally, broken. Gaffney signed the last page with a flourish he hadn't earned, handed the folder back to Wolfe, and leaned back in the red leather chair like he was closing a deal instead of dismantling an empire. I watched him with a stillness I'd learned from Wolfe. 1 part patience, 2 parts calculation. When you're watching a man like Gaffney, you don't interrupt. You let the silence press on him like gravity. He broke it first. "Is that all?" he asked, smoothing his tie. "Will I be permitted to leave?" Wolfe gave a soft grunt, the kind that usually preceded either a philosophical tangent or a summary execution. This time, it was the former. "Permit is not the word," Wolfe said. "You are not being held, but make no mistake, Mr. Gaffney. You are now accounted for. If you flee, you will be chased. If you lie again, you will be exposed. If you so much as attempt to rebuild this operation elsewhere, I will personally hand-deliver this file to the Gazette, the District Attorney, and the United States Postal Inspection Service. That last one, I believe, frightens even you." Gaffney gave a short, bitter laugh. "You're very sure of yourself." "I'm sure of logic," Wolfe replied. "You ran a long, subtle scheme, but you placed it in the hands of people. And people are where every system fails." He didn't say, "like Paul," but the implication sat between us like a fingerprint on glass. Gaffney stood, straightened his cuffs, and gave me a look as though I might offer him a parting handshake. I didn't. He left with a quiet click of the front door behind him. I waited until the sound of his footsteps faded, then turned to Wolfe. "You believe he'll keep his mouth shut?" "I do," Wolfe said. "Out of self-interest. His kind always chooses survival. And if he doesn't? Then we revisit the matter, perhaps with fewer courtesies." He rose, slowly, stiffly, like the mental toll had finally reached his legs, and crossed to the window. Outside, a breeze shifted the branches of the street's only decent tree, and I could see dusk falling over the roof lines like a curtain on the final act. Behind me, Paul stirred. He hadn't said a word during the confrontation with Gaffney, hadn't flinched once. Now he cleared his throat. "So that's it?" he asked. "It's over." Wolfe turned from the window. "It is finished, which is not the same as over." Paul frowned. The enterprise has been dissolved, its participants exposed, but the photographs are gone, the victims unnotified, and the public spared the spectacle. What remains now is damage, unseen, unquantified, and unfortunately, unpunished. That doesn't sound like justice. Wolfe nodded. It is not. It is containment. I saw Paul absorb that, the way guilt does, slowly and then all at once. You didn't ask why I winked, he said suddenly, looking at me. I blinked. Didn't think it mattered. It mattered, he said. I saw you come in that night. You didn't look like the others. Suits, phones, appointments, they all ignore the waiters. But you watched, you noticed. I figured if anyone would recognize what I was doing, it'd be someone who made a living spotting things. You figured right. I thought I had time, he said quietly. I didn't know the jar had already been sent to Wolfe's house. Neither did we, I said. But you played it right. You did more than most would. Wolfe interjected then, tone cool. You disrupted a pattern of exploitation. You revealed a conduit for coercion. You also trespassed, misled, and endangered yourself. And us. It is not virtue, but it is value. Paul gave a short laugh. You know how to give a compliment. Wolfe made a noise that might have been a cough, or disapproval. It was hard to tell. I should go, Paul said, standing. You said I'd need to leave the city. You will, Wolfe said. I've arranged accommodations with a colleague in Vermont. He runs a modest orchard. You will be useful. Apples? Paul asked, surprised. Cider, Wolfe said. Hard. I understand you are familiar with fermentation. Paul gave a slight grin. Better than I am with garlic oil. Wolfe made no reply, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch, a private gesture that passed for approval in our little corner of civilization. Paul shook my hand, took the train schedule I gave him, and promised to keep his head down. Then he was gone, taking with him the last tendrils of a case that had snuck in like steam and left like smoke. After the door closed, I sank into the red chair and looked at Wolfe. Tell me something, I said. Why did they use garlic oil? He opened his eyes. Just a crack. Neutral scent, uniform viscosity, low interest. No one opens a sealed jar of garlic oil unless they intend to use it. And no one does that in a fine kitchen unless it's been pre-approved. It was the perfect container. But it wasn't the oil, I said. It was the silence, the routine. Tuesday, garlic oil, back shelf, no questions. Yes, Wolfe said. The real courier wasn't Paul. It was a habit. That line sat in the room for a moment, then faded into the creak of the radiator and the gentle shuffle of Fritz preparing dinner. Speaking of which, what's on the menu? I asked. Cornish hens with rosemary and saffron rice. I frowned. Saffron? After all this, you trust the spices again? I trust Fritz, Wolfe said, and I trust that anyone foolish enough to tamper again will find I'm now very alert. Dinner was served at 7:15. The hens were perfect, the rice fragrant. Wolfe ate in silence for 5 full minutes before speaking again. It is a strange thing, he said, dabbing his lips, to hide malice inside garlic. A metaphor, perhaps, that something sharp, bold, and useful may still conceal corruption. That's human nature, I said. All flavor and cover-up. He gave me a look. That was almost insightful. Thank you. It wasn't a compliment. I know, I said, smiling, but I'm still taking it. He sighed. Archie, please. More wine. I poured. Outside, the city turned its face to evening, unaware that its secrets had almost been served cold. Inside, the brownstone exhaled, the tension slowly leaving its walls. The kitchen was clean again. The shelves were whole. And somewhere in Vermont, a waiter with a good eye was learning how to bottle something honest. And Nero Wolfe, he was satisfied. For now. which, in this house, is as close to peace as we ever get. The brownstone returned to its usual rhythms, or at least pretended to. Fritz resumed guarding the pantry with a renewed vigilance, the orchids drank their daily mist, and Wolfe resumed pretending not to listen to the radio until the news mentioned something sufficiently outrageous to provoke a monologue. But if you knew how to listen, and I do, you could tell the piece was artificial, like a soufflé that looks fine on top but is half collapsed underneath. Wolfe was disturbed, not in the shouting, foot-stomping kind of way you get from men who argue with traffic, but in the quiet, subterranean way that makes you question whether a second glass of beer might push him into quoting Tacitus at lunch. It wasn't the blackmail ring. That had been neutralized. It wasn't even Gaffney, who had, true to Wolfe's prediction, retreated to whatever glass tower he called home, hiring lawyers by the hour to make polite noises about asset, restructuring, and denials of knowledge. What bothered Wolfe was that someone had walked into his house, undetected, on purpose. That wasn't just a crime, that was blasphemy. You realize, I said, as we sat in the office 2 days after Paul's departure, that you've now had the pantry audited by 3 different locksmiths, a private security consultant, and a guy Fritz swears was an ex-Stasi agent, and they all said the same thing. No evidence of forced entry, nothing missing besides the jar. Wolfe didn't look up. They are wrong. You think the garlic oil was a decoy? I think more was taken. Then why haven't we noticed? Because it was something conceptual, he said, and I could see the wheels beginning to click. Not an object, a placement, an implication. You're going to have to come down a few floors for me. Wolfe steepled his fingers. We know the jar was removed, but what if it was not only removed? What if it was replaced before that? Subtly. Not to mislead, but to signal. To whom? To me. I stared. You think the break-in was a message? Sent to you? Not a message. A mirror. Designed to reveal how much I already knew, and how much I had yet to discover. Okay, I said. Now you're definitely off the stairs and floating somewhere above street level. Can we start with who would be insane enough to bait you inside your own walls? The same sort of person, Wolfe said evenly, who would construct a blackmail scheme out of olive oil and trust waiters to ferry it. He leaned back. Gaffney was not the origin. I blinked. Wait. I thought we agreed. He was the financier, the organizer. Yes, but not the inventor. I sat forward. You're telling me someone higher than Gaffney cooked this up? Not higher. Earlier. Gaffney took over a structure that already existed. And how do you know that? Wolfe picked up the now infamous folder Gaffney had signed. Because of this date, he pointed, a line buried on the 3rd page. Operations adapted from E&S routing model 2021, quarter 4. Adapted, Wolfe said softly. Not designed. Someone else built the skeleton. Gaffney merely put flesh on it. That changed the game. I stood and paced. So who the hell built the skeleton? Someone who understood restaurants, supply chains, psychology. And garlic, I said. Wolfe nodded. Indeed. Just then, the phone rang. I picked it up. Archie Goodwin, I said. The voice was unfamiliar, but precise. Cultured. The kind of voice that wears gloves even when nobody's watching. I suggest you tell Mr. Wolfe to stop sniffing around bones that don't belong to him. I didn't move. Who is this? The line clicked. Dead. I hung up. We just got a call. Wolfe's eyes opened. Yes? They don't want you sniffing skeletons. He said nothing. Just reached, slowly, and turned his chair towards the window. You were right, I said. There's another layer. There always is. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass and handed it to him. He didn't object. This one's personal, I said. No, Wolfe replied, swirling the glass gently. This one is architectural. I waited. Gaffney may have thought himself the architect, but he was merely a contractor. The real designer built this to last. Redundancy, silence, substitution. Only someone disrupted the blueprint. Paul. Yes, but Paul's gone. Vermont. For his safety, but not for his silence. You think they'll go after him? They may try, but I suspect they're more interested in preserving the blueprint than punishing the leak. I leaned against the doorframe. So what now? Wolfe sipped his bourbon, then set it down. Now we go back to the beginning. Rondelay. Number earlier. The model. Edel and Schwartz's roots prior to Gaffney's involvement. I want the original map, the shipments, the clients. I want to know where the first pattern began. I'll call Saul. Do that. Should I be worried? Always. Saul arrived that evening, rain in his coat and steel in his gaze. He carried a USB stick and a grim expression. Got into E&S's archived invoices, he said. Back channel, through an ex-employee who now runs a spice shop in Astoria. Wolfe gestured. Show us. Saul plugged in the drive. I loaded it on the office monitor. There it was. Q4, 2021. A list of shipments from Edel and Schwartz to a different restaurant entirely. La Goulou, I read aloud. Wolfe's brows twitched. La Goulou is defunct, he said. Closed last year, I confirmed. Fire in the kitchen. Whole place condemned. Too convenient, Wolfe murmured. Look further. I scrolled. The same routing model. Tuesdays, garlic oil shipments, same weight discrepancies. That's our origin, I said. Same method. Different house. Find out who ran it, Wolfe said. An hour later, I had it. La Goulou's owner of record was Vincent Selby. Wolfe closed his eyes. That, he said, is the name Gaffney never mentioned. Why? Because Selby wasn't his partner. He was his predecessor. You think Selby created the operation? Yes. And when the restaurant burned, he went underground, or upmarket. Perhaps he sold the model, or perhaps he stayed nearby, like Gaffney's silent partner. Precisely. Wolfe rose, a rare thing made more meaningful by its timing. Tomorrow, he said, you will find Selby. Use every contact. He is the key. And when I do, Wolfe turned back toward the window. Then the true architect will have to step into the light. I paused at the door. You know what this means, don't you? What? The waiter didn't just wink to start a case. He winked to start a war. Wolfe didn't answer. But I didn't need him to. He was already preparing for battle. From his chair, with his mind. Where he always wins. Finding Vincent Selby wasn't easy. For a man who'd once owned one of the most talked-about kitchens on the Upper East Side, he'd gone ghost with a precision that would make Houdini blush. No social media, no forwarding address, and a tax record that stopped right after the fire that took out La Goulou's back prep line and most of its records. If I'd needed more proof he was involved in something dirty, that last fact alone would have pushed me over. But Wolfe had said, find him. And I've learned never to mistake that as a suggestion. So I called Long Cohen, Saul Panzer, Fred Durkin, and a bartender I knew who had a photographic memory for patrons who tipped in silence. By the afternoon, we had a match. Not a direct one, but a whisper. Selby had been spotted in a members-only supper club in the East 50s. Low lights, high ceilings, and the kind of crowd that thinks being secretive is the same as being important. The bartender, bless him, remembered the man because he ordered a particular Armagnac no one under 70 usually touches. Chateau de l'Aubade, 1972, and had once tipped him with a 50 folded into a rectangle so tight it looked like a fortune cookie message. I'll go, I told Wolfe. Discreet? No, he said. Direct. That was interesting. Wolfe almost never opens with a frontal assault unless he knows the target has already retreated inward. I got dressed like I was headed to blackmail a senator. Dark suit, clean shave, borrowed tie from Wolfe's second drawer, and strolled into the supper club like I'd just been made vice president of something irrelevant but rich. I didn't ask for Selby by name. I simply ordered the same Armagnac, tipped the bartender with a duplicate 50, and waited. Subtlety is sometimes just well-dressed mimicry. 15 minutes later, he sat down at the stool next to me. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. So much for subtle. He was thinner than the last photo I'd found. Grey hair trimmed short, blue shirt so crisp it probably had a stock portfolio. The voice was educated, clipped, and used sparingly. The eyes were tired but sharp, like he saw only what was useful and ignored everything else. "Mr. Selby," I said, "you've been missed." "That depends on who's looking." I sipped the Armagnac. Smooth, layered, expensive. "I'm not here to threaten you." "No," he said, "you're here to deliver an invitation." From Nero Wolfe. So much for subtle. Part 2. "You know him?" "I know of him. He's the man people send when they can't afford to call the police." "He's the man people call when the police would only get in the way." He nodded. "And he knows?" "He knows everything Gaffney didn't." Selby exhaled. "Then I suppose it's time." "For what?" "To explain the blueprint." He came to the brownstone that night. No need for threats. No need for coercion. Selby walked in like he'd made peace with being dissected by a man who hadn't left his house in over 2 decades. Wolfe, in rare form, had not moved from his desk but had cleared everything else from it. No books, no clutter, just space. Space for truth, unadorned and inescapable. Selby took the client chair, declined coffee, offered no handshake. Wolfe opened. "You conceived the conduit," he said. "Garlic oil, Tuesday shipments, inventory rotation. You established it at La Goulou." "Yes," Selby said. "Why?" Selby didn't flinch. "Because information has always been more valuable than money. And restaurants," he said, "are blind spots. Places where no one looks closely, because they trust the appearance of order. You exploited that. I used it to protect others, at first." Wolfe narrowed his eyes. "At first." Selby nodded. It began with a single package. Documents meant to expose a city councilman's connection to a property scam. I moved it through the supply chain. Quietly. It worked. "So you repeated it?" "Yes, but others noticed. A man like Gaffney sees function and turns it into finance. He offered to fund expansion. I declined. He didn't need my permission. And you vanished. I burned the restaurant. No one was harmed, but it was a message." "Not to Gaffney," Wolfe said. "To yourself." Selby didn't reply. Wolfe's voice softened. "You had guilt." "I still do," Selby said. Wolfe paused. "The break-in here. That was you?" "Yes." "Why?" Selby turned to me. "Because I knew Paul would come to you, and if he did, it meant someone had interfered. If they had, you would investigate. And if you investigated, I needed to know how close you'd come. So you left the garlic oil and took a jar to see if we'd notice." "I took the wrong jar," Selby admitted. "Gaffney had already slipped a duplicate in. He was panicking. That was my final warning." "Why come forward now?" I asked. "Because I know Wolfe. If he was involved, it meant the system was dead, or about to be." Wolfe nodded. "It is." Selby's voice dropped. "I'm not asking for protection. I know what I did. But if you give them the documents I've brought, it will ensure no one can rebuild what we built." He reached into his coat and placed a manila envelope on Wolfe's desk. Wolfe didn't touch it. He looked at Selby with a kind of cold mercy I'd only seen a few times before. "Guilt is cheap, Mr. Selby," he said. "Clarity, however, is rare, and for that I thank you." Selby stood. "I'll go quietly." "You'll go completely," Wolfe said. "Out of this city. If I see your name again, even in a menu, I will ensure it appears next in a headline." Selby nodded once, turned, and left. The door closed, behind him like a verdict. We ate late that night, braised lamb with rosemary, polenta, and an herbed salad that Fritz claimed was a palate cleanser, but I knew was penance for recent sins. Wolfe was quiet, contemplative, not disturbed, but, if I had to guess, almost melancholy. After the dishes had been cleared, I poured a final glass of brandy and asked, "So, what happens now?" Wolfe leaned back, full and tired. "Nothing." "Nothing?" "The conduit is broken, the architect is dismantled, the imitators have no foundation. Guilt has spoken, and the orchids will bloom regardless." "That's poetic. It's botanical." I sipped. "You didn't win this one by force." "I never do." "You didn't even win it with facts." "No," he said. "This one I won with understanding." I raised my glass. "To the waiter who winked." Wolfe raised his. "To the waiter who warned." We drank. The brown stone at last was quiet again. The case was over. Not in the way the public likes, a handcuffed villain dragged to court, a dramatic newspaper headline with grainy photos and exaggerated adjectives, but in the way that matters. Quietly, completely. With the right people exposed and the rest warned off. The morning after Selby's confession, Saul delivered the final documents: bank transfers, supply chain manifests, internal memos from Edel and Schwartz. Wolfe read them all in silence, then placed the envelope on the lower shelf of his safe behind the second volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall, where he keeps things that are either priceless or radioactive. Inspector Kramer dropped by that afternoon, wearing a face like he'd chewed the wrong end of a lemon and blamed us for the tree. We gave him what he needed: names, timelines, proof. He grunted, scratched his neck, and growled, "You should have called me sooner." Wolfe didn't bother replying. I escorted the inspector out with a grin and a diplomatic shrug. Paul Rizzoli, meanwhile, had settled into orchard life in Vermont. He wrote once, an actual letter, ink on paper, thanking Wolfe and reporting that he'd begun helping with the fermentation process and found it oddly meditative. He ended with a postscript. "Turns out cider doesn't lie. If it's rotten, you know it. People should be more like that." Wolfe had me read the letter aloud, and when I was done, he simply said, "Indeed," and went back to pruning his orchids. I knew what he meant, and I knew that was his version of pride. But the real resolution came a week later. It was just after breakfast, and Wolfe had settled into the office with a glass of beer and a frown reserved for early morning correspondence. I was reviewing bills. The phone rang. "Archie Goodwin," I said. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, clipped and cautious. "I'm calling for Mr. Wolfe. He's here. Tell him it's over. We won't use the restaurants. Again. The system has been dismantled. That's not a threat, it's a conclusion." I paused. Who is this? But the line had already gone dead. I turned to Wolfe. That was someone anonymous and polite. "Ah," he said, not looking up. The final ripple. "You believe him?" "I believe he understands what silence is worth." "And what was this one worth?" Wolfe closed the folder he was reading, set it aside, and looked up at me with that rare, heavy clarity he reserves for final pronouncements. "It was worth preserving the integrity of this house," he said. "It was worth preserving order." He paused, then added, "And it was worth reminding the world that justice is not always a courtroom. Sometimes it is a table, set properly, in balance." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a metaphor." "No," he said. "That's dinner." Fritz announced it at that exact moment. Veal with sage butter, truffled potatoes, and a green salad so crisp it snapped under the fork. Wolfe stood, rare again and deliberate. As he moved toward the dining room, he added one last thought. We did not catch a killer, Archie. We caught something worse. A mind that believed deception was elegant. I followed. And was it? No, Wolfe said simply. It was efficient, and that, in the end, is the real danger. We sat. The table was set. Order had returned. Balance had been restored. Outside, the city kept moving fast and distracted. Inside, the brownstone was quiet again. For now. 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 For now.